4 in the morning, the Philippine Sea. The cruiser CG-62 USS Chancellorsville was cutting through 3-meter swells when the first alert tone shattered the quiet of the bridge. This was not a routine drill or a false positive triggered by a passing merchant vessel. 140 kilometers to the northwest, a Chinese Type 55 destroyer had just transitioned its radar from search mode to a high-intensity fire control track. The air inside the Combat Information Center was thick with the hum of electronics and the smell of recycled air and ozone. Every sailor in the room felt the sudden, sharp shift in the atmosphere as the ship's Aegis Combat System identified a massive energy spike consistent with a vertical launch. The threat was immediate and lethal. A single YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile had cleared its launch cell and was currently accelerating to Mach 0.8 for its initial cruise phase. The sea below was a dark, churning void of deep indigo, but the sky above the Chinese destroyer was momentarily bleached white by the blinding glare of the missile's solid rocket booster. On the radar screens of the Chancellorsville, the contact was designated as Vampire 1. It was moving with a purposeful, predatory logic, hugging the surface of the water at an altitude of less than 15 meters to stay beneath the cruiser's primary radar horizon for as long as possible. The commanding officer of the Chancellorsville arrived in the Combat Information Center 45 seconds after the first alarm. He did not need a briefing to understand the gravity of the situation. The Type 55 destroyer is one of the most capable surface combatants in the world, carrying 112 vertical launch cells packed with a variety of sophisticated weaponry. If one missile was in the air, more were likely to follow. The tactical action officer reported that the incoming projectile was performing a high-speed sea-skimming maneuver, making it nearly invisible against the clutter of the wave tops. The humidity of the Philippine Sea seemed to press against the hull of the ship, a heavy, salt-laden weight that contrasted with the cold, calculated precision of the digital displays. On the bridge, the lookouts squinted into the darkness, though they knew they would see nothing until the missile's terminal motor ignited for its final supersonic dash. The Chancellorsville was a veteran of the United States Navy, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser designed specifically to defend carrier strike groups against exactly this kind of saturation attack. However, being the primary target changed the mathematics of survival. The ship's 4 massive phased array radar faces, part of the ANSPY-1 Delta system, were now emitting at maximum power, punching through the tropical moisture to maintain a lock on the incoming threat. The electronic signature of the cruiser was now a screaming beacon in the electromagnetic spectrum, visible to every sensor within 500 kilometers. Inside the hull, the order for general quarters sent hundreds of sailors racing to their stations. Steel hatches were slammed shut and dogged down, turning the cruiser into a series of airtight compartments. In the engine rooms, the 4 General Electric LM-2500 gas turbine engines roared to life, pushing fairing seconding the ship toward a defensive speed of 30 knots. The vibration of the hull increased, a deep, rhythmic shuddering that could be felt in the marrow of the crew's bones. They were no longer a passive observer of regional tensions. They were the focal point of a kinetic engagement between 2 of the world's most powerful navies. The tactical situation was deteriorating with every passing second. The YJ-18 was not just a fire-and-forget weapon. It was receiving mid-course updates from the Type 55 destroyer, allowing it to adjust its path to account for the cruiser's evasive maneuvers. The distance had closed to 90 kilometers. At this range, the STOT missile would transition into its supersonic terminal phase in less than 3 minutes, accelerating to Mach 3 for the final strike. The crew of the Chancellorsville had trained for years for a moment that would be decided in a matter of heartbeats. The ship began to heel hard to starboard as the helmsman executed a sharp turn, attempting to present the smallest possible radar cross-section to the approaching threat while bringing the cruiser's own missile launchers into an optimal firing arc. 4:07 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the cruiser CG-62, USS Chancellorsville, became a focused hive of controlled intensity. As the Aegis Combat System transitioned into automatic engagement mode, the massive computers of the Baseline 9 upgrade began processing the physics of 3 distinct incoming threats. To the north, the Type 55 destroyer had doubled down, launching 2 more YJ-18 missiles to join the first. The radar screen now showed 3 hostile tracks, designated as Vampires 1, 2, and 3, spaced in a staggered formation, designed to overwhelm a single defender. The air in the command center felt pressurized, vibrating with the cooling fans of the high-powered servers and the low, constant hum of the ship's primary electrical bus. On the tactical display, the interception geometry was being calculated in microseconds. The first layer of the cruiser's defense was the Standard Missile 2. Deep within the forward and aft Mark 41 vertical launch systems, the computers initiated the firing sequence for 4 interceptors. There was a series of muffled thuds that echoed through the lower decks as the protective hatches of the launch cells were blown open by internal charges. A split second later, the first Standard Missile 2 ignited. The sound was a deafening, metallic roar that traveled through the steel structure of the ship, a violent vibration that rattled every rack and workstation. A pillar of white smoke and orange flame punched skyward from the forward deck, momentarily blinding the bridge crew and leaving the acrid, chemical scent of solid rocket fuel hanging in the humid air. The missile accelerated instantly, clearing the deck and pitching over toward the northern horizon at a speed exceeding Mach 2. 3 more missiles followed in rapid succession, their exhaust trails weaving a complex pattern of white streaks against the pre-dawn darkness. As the Standard missiles climbed into the upper atmosphere to gain a kinetic advantage, the Chancellorsville's electronic warfare suite, the ANSLQ-32, began its own invisible battle. The system emitted high-energy bursts of electromagnetic interference, attempting to blind the active radar seekers on the incoming Chinese missiles. The air around the ship's upper masts crackled with the sheer volume of radio frequency energy being pumped into the sky. On the bridge, the digital displays flickered as the ship's own sensors struggled to filter out the massive amount of electronic noise. The goal was to create a series of false targets, a ghost fleet that would lure the YJ-18s away from the cruiser's actual hull. The tactical action officer watched the engagement range drop with clinical detachment. The Standard missiles were, now, 60 kilometers out, their rocket motors burned out, and their guidance fins twitching as they adjusted to the terminal maneuvers of the incoming vampires. Suddenly, the tactical display flickered. Vampire 1 executed a violent, high-G barrel roll at the edge of the cruiser's horizon. It was a pre-programmed evasive maneuver designed to break a radar lock. 2 of the Standard missiles missed their mark, exploding in the empty air behind the Chinese weapon. The 3rd Standard missile found its target. A brilliant white flash illuminating the sea for 50 miles as the Coppin warhead shredded Vampire 3 into thousands of pieces of burning debris. However, Vampires 1 and 2 remained on course. They had now transitioned to their terminal supersonic phase. The roar of their engines, though miles away, seemed to be felt as a growing pressure in the atmosphere. The range was now 30 kilometers. The Chancellorsville was forced to drop to its second layer of defense, the evolved Sea Sparrow missile. These weapons were smaller, faster, and designed for close-in, high-agility intercepts. 8 more cells on the Mark 41 vertical launch system cycled open. The sound of these launches was sharper, a high-pitched scream that tore through the salt-heavy air. Inside the ship, the damage control teams were already standing by in their heavy fire-retardant suits, their faces slick with sweat beneath their masks. They knew the statistics. In a saturation attack, even the best defense has a mathematical limit. The cruiser was now heeling 30 degrees to port as it began a radical zigzag maneuver, the wake of the ship carving a massive white scar across the dark Philippine Sea. The smell of hot metal and stressed machinery began to rise from the engine rooms as the gas turbines pushed the propulsion system to its absolute red line. The evolved Sea Sparrow missiles streaked away from the ship, their white-hot exhaust reflecting off the wave tops. The bridge windows shook with the pressure of the launches. The first of the Sea Sparrows impacted Vampire 2 at a range of 12 kilometers, creating a secondary explosion that sent a donnery rain of molten metal into the water. But Vampire 1 was still there. It was a silver blur moving at 3 times the speed of sound, barely 10 meters above the swells. It was now within the range of the ship's last-ditch defense, the 20mm close-in weapon system. The automated Gatling gun on the port side began to slew, its search radar locking onto the final lethal threat. The deck began to vibrate with a high-frequency chatter as the gun prepared to fire its first burst of depleted uranium rounds. 4:09 in the morning, at coordinates 18 degrees 12 minutes north, 128 degrees 40 minutes east, the darkness of the Philippine Sea was shattered by a continuous, buzzing roar. The port-side close-in weapon system on the USS Chancellorsville had opened fire. The Phalanx mount, a white, dome-top turret, was slewing at its maximum rate, tracking the silver blur of the YJ-18 missile as it closed the final 3,000 meters. A stream of 20mm armor-piercing tungsten rounds poured from the 6-barrel Gatling gun at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. The tracers created a solid line of white light that reached out into the blackness, searching for the incoming warhead. The air around the mount was instantly filled with the sharp, metallic stench of burnt cordite and the ozone smell of high-voltage electronics. The deck beneath the gun mount buckled and vibrated with the mechanical violence of the weapon's operation. 2,000 meters out, the YJ-18 performed a final, chaotic, zig-and-zag maneuver. It was moving at 3 times the speed of sound, its kinetic energy so immense that it was heating the air around its nose cone to over 500 degrees. The close-in weapon system adjusted, its radar locked onto the missile's heat signature, and a second burst of fire tore through the sky. Several tungsten rounds struck the missile's airframe, shredding the control fins, but the momentum of the weapon was already unstoppable. The impact occurred 0.5 seconds later. The missile did not strike the hull directly, but punched through the thin aluminum plating of the aft superstructure, just above the main deck level. The 300-kilogram high-explosive warhead detonated inside the ship's office spaces and electronic workshop. The sound was not a single bang, but a catastrophic multi-stage roar of tearing metal and expanding gas. A fireball of orange and white flame erupted from the port side, rising 50 meters into the air and momentarily outshining the stars. The shockwave slammed through the interior of the ship, throwing sailors off their feet and shattering reinforced glass windows on the bridge 40 meters away. Inside the hull, the world turned into a nightmare of heat and flying debris. The explosion severed the primary fire main and destroyed the redundant fiber optic cables for the aft radar arrays. Thick, oily black smoke began to pour from the jagged hole in the superstructure, which was now glowing a dull cherry red from the intense thermal energy of the blast. The smell of burning insulation, hydraulic fluid, and charred paint filled the passageways. On the bridge, the commanding officer felt the ship shudder and heel sharply to starboard as the force of the explosion pushed the 10,000-ton cruiser sideways through the water. The emergency lighting flickered and then died, leaving the crew in a terrifying, smoky twilight. Illuminated only by the red glow of battle lanterns, the cruiser was now a wounded giant. The primary tactical display in the Combat Information Center went dark, as the servers for the aft sensors were crushed by the structural collapse of the deck above. The tactical action officer shouted for damage reports over sensor, the internal sound-powered phones. The initial assessment was grim. Fire was spreading rapidly through the aluminum-intensive superstructure, and the heat was becoming so intense that it threatened to ignite the ready-service ammunition stored in the nearby magazines. The sea spray, once a cooling mist, now turned to steam. As it hit the white-hot metal of the impact zone, creating a hissing, ghostly shroud around the midship section. The ship's propulsion remained intact, but the steering gear was temporarily unresponsive due to a surge in the electrical grid. The naval warship was still moving at 30 knots, trailing a long plume of fire and smoke that marked its position for any other incoming threats. In the damage control lockers, sailors began to struggle. Into their oxygen-breathing apparatuses, their movements urgent but disciplined. They knew that the first 10 minutes after an impact decided whether a ship lived or died. The cold salt air of the Philippine Sea was now a memory, replaced by a searing, chemical heat that clawed at the lungs of every man and woman on the deck. 4:15 in the morning. The USS Chancellorsville was fighting for its life as the fires in the aft superstructure reached temperatures of over 800 degrees. The air in the narrow, lightless passageways was a thick, choking curtain of toxic black smoke that reduced visibility to less than 30 centimeters. Damage Control Team 1, led by a chief petty officer, with 15 years of experience, pushed through the oppressive heat while dragging a 1 3/4-inch fire hose toward the center of the impact zone. The sound of the pressurized seawater hitting the white-hot aluminum was a deafening, continuous hiss that drowned out the rhythmic groaning of the ship's damaged structural frames. Salt water and aqueous film-forming foam flooded the deck, mixing with spilled hydraulic fluid to create a slick, dangerous slurry that shifted violently with every roll of the cruiser. The crew worked in a state of calculated desperation, their oxygen-breathing apparatuses hissing with every breath as they struggled to contain the blaze before it reached the missile magazines. The skin of the ship was so hot that the sea spray hitting the exterior hull turned instantly to steam, surrounding the Chancellorsville in a ghostly, white shroud. Despite the chaos, the discipline of the military forces held firm. Every sailor knew their role, and every movement was dictated by years of high-intensity training. In the mess decks, which had been rapidly converted into a primary triage station, the medical officer and 4 corpsmen worked under the dim, flickering red light of battery-powered lanterns. 12 sailors had been caught in the initial blast, suffering from severe flash burns and traumatic shrapnel wounds that required immediate stabilization. The smell of burnt copper and antiseptic hung heavy in the humid, stagnant air, clashing with the acrid stench of the fire, raging just 2 decks above. The ship's executive officer moved through the space, providing a steady presence of command while coordinating the transport of the most critically wounded to the flight deck for a potential medevac. Down in the main engine room, the engineering duty officer struggled to maintain electrical power to the forward Aegis radar arrays while isolating the short-circuited aft sections of the ship. Every time the cruiser's primary circuit breakers tripped, the massive ANSPY-1 Delta radar faces flickered, momentarily leaving the vessel blind to any follow-on attacks from the foreign military destroyer. The heat from the fire was beginning to conduct through the steel bulkheads, causing the paint to blister and peel in the adjacent ammunition handling rooms. The engineers worked in a sweltering environment of 110 degrees, their coveralls soaked with sweat as they manually bypassed damaged power lines. The cruiser's steering gear, which had been frozen by the initial shock of the impact, was finally restored after a harrowing 10-minute effort by the aft steering crew. Working in a cramped, smoky compartment at the very rear of the ship, they used manual hydraulic pumps to bring the rudders back to center. This allowed the cruiser to finally break its predictable, straight-line course and begin weaving through the swells once again. The vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines increased as the ship accelerated to 25 knots, attempting to create a relative wind that would blow the smoke away from the bridge and the forward sensor masts. Outside, the Philippine Sea remained a vast, indifferent expanse of dark water, the waves slapping against the scorched hull with a rhythmic, hollow sound. A trail of burning debris and fuel oil stretched for 2 kilometers behind the ship, marking a path of orange light on the surface of the ocean that could be seen by overhead satellites. The military forces were no longer merely responding to a provocation. It was now engaged in a struggle to keep a 10,000-ton capital ship from becoming a total loss in the middle of a combat zone. The sun was still 2 hours from rising, and the most dangerous phase of the engagement was only just beginning. 4:22 in the morning, 200 kilometers to the east of the burning cruiser, the flight deck of the aircraft carrier, USS Ronald Reagan, erupted into a frantic, controlled chaos of steam and steel. The distress signal from the USS Chancellorsville had reached the strike group commander exactly 3 minutes earlier, bypassing the usual chain of command through an automated flash priority override. The carrier, the centerpiece of Carrier Strike Group 5, was already turning hard into the wind, its 4 massive propellers, turning the Philippine Sea into a boiling white wake. The air on the flight deck was a freezing gale, thick with the sharp, chemical sting of JP-5 jet fuel and the metallic scent of high-pressure steam leaking from the catapult tracks. The mission was immediate. Combat air support. 4 FA-18 Block 3 Super Hornets from the dam busters of Strike Fighter Squadron 195 were being moved from the deck edge to the waist catapults. The yellow-shirted flight deck directors moved with a mechanical precision, their hand signals illuminated by the glow of their chemical light sticks. Under the dim red floodlights of the carrier's island superstructure, the ground crews scrambled to perform the final pre-flight checks, their movements a blur of practiced efficiency. Each fighter was heavily laden, with 4 AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and 2 AGM-88 HARM missiles, designed specifically to destroy the radar systems of enemy warships. The first FA-18 taxied onto catapult number 3, its nose gear kneeling into the shuttle. The pilot, a lieutenant commander, with over 2,000 flight hours, adjusted his night vision goggles and scanned the cockpit displays, which were bathed in a soft green glow. The vibration of the carrier's nuclear-powered engines hummed through the soles of his boots, a low-frequency power that signaled the immense scale of the machine beneath him. He felt the tension in the catapult build, a physical weight that seemed to compress the air in the cockpit. With a sharp salute to the catapult officer, he braced his head against the seat. The launch was a violent, 4-second transition from standstill to 260 kilometers per hour. The catapult fired, with a sound like a thunderclap, a massive release of steam that momentarily obscured the flight deck in a white cloud. The FA-18 was flung into the pitch-black sky, its twin engines screaming in full afterburner, 2 long cones of blue and orange flame pushing the aircraft toward the horizon. 3 more fighters followed at 40-second intervals, their exhaust trails carving glowing arcs across the Philippine Sea. They were climbing rapidly to an altitude of 10,000 meters, pushing their airframes to the limit to close the distance to the Chancellorsville. While the fighters were in the air, the USS Ronald Reagan was also coordinating a broader response with the rest of the strike group. The destroyer USS Barry, located 30 kilometers north of the carrier, was ordered to break formation and sprint toward the cruiser's last known coordinates. The tactical controllers in the carrier's Carrier Air Wing Center were now managing a complex web of data links, integrating the radar feeds from an E-2 Delta Hawkeye early warning aircraft with the surviving sensors on the wounded cruiser. The goal was to build a complete tactical picture of the Chinese Type 55 destroyer, which was currently attempting to maneuver into a position to finish off the Chancellorsville. The humidity of the tropical night pressed against the cockpit canopies of the flying Super Hornets, but inside, the pilots were breathing pure, cold oxygen. They were now less than 12 minutes from the engagement zone. On their multifunction displays, the infrared signature of the burning Chancellorsville appeared as a brilliant white star against the dark background of the ocean. To the northwest, the electronic warfare sensors were picking up the aggressive search pulses of the Chinese destroyer's radar. The lead pilot clicked his radio, his voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline surging through his system. He authorized his wingmen to arm their weapon systems and prepare for a high-speed, low-altitude approach. 4:35 in the morning. The Philippine Sea. Despite the heavy black smoke billowing from its aft superstructure, the USS Chancellorsville was not finished. The forward Mark 41 vertical launch system remained fully operational, powered by an emergency electrical bypass established by the engineering teams. The commanding officer, standing on a bridge illuminated by the flickering red of battle lanterns and the orange glare of the fire's midships, gave the order to release batteries. The target was the Chinese Type 55 destroyer, now identified as the Lhasa, which was closing to within 35 kilometers to deliver a finishing blow. The trigger was squeezed in the Combat Information Center. Deep within the forward hull, the computer-sequenced firing locks disengaged with a series of heavy metallic clacks that could be felt through the deck plates. A split second later, the first of 8 Tomahawk Block 5 missiles ignited. The missile shrieked off the rail, a massive white column of fire punching backward through the venting system and washing across the forward deck. The heat blast was so intense it scorched the remaining gray paint off the nearby bulkheads and sent a cloud of steam rising from the wet steel. The roar was a physical force, a deep, guttural thrum that drowned out the sound of the fires raging aft. The smoke rose in a dense, swirling pillar that blotted out the stars for 3 full seconds as the missile arched toward the northwest, its solid rocket booster shedding in a shower of sparks before the turbofan engine kicked in at Mach 0.9. The Tomahawk skimmed the whitecaps, guided by a composite of GPS and the surviving forward radar of the Chancellorsville. 7 more missiles followed in a relentless 10-second interval, creating a wall of kinetic energy racing across the dark water. The Chinese destroyer attempted to engage its own HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, but the sheer volume of the American volley, combined with the low-altitude approach, proved overwhelming. The first Tomahawk warhead, carrying 450 kilograms of high explosives, punched clean through the portside bow of the Type 55 just below the waterline. The steel hull of the Chinese ship was ripped open like paper, the force of the kinetic impact alone buckling the forward internal bulkheads. A millisecond later, the second and third missiles struck midships, detonating directly against the Type 55's own vertical launch cells. The result was a catastrophic secondary explosion. A fireball of blinding white and yellow light bleached the sky, rising 100 meters into the air and reflecting off the low-hanging tropical clouds. The turret of the Chinese ship's 130mm main gun was lifted straight off its mount, 6 tons of armored steel rising 5 meters into the air, before falling back and crushing the forward superstructure. The sound was a jagged, multi-stage detonation that cracked eardrums and sent a pressure wave rolling across the sea, flattening the swells for a kilometer in every direction. Black, oily smoke boiled out of the jagged ruptures in the ship's side as the hull began to groan under the internal pressure of the fires. The crew of the Lhasa did not stand still. On the listing deck, Chinese sailors fought to bring their aft close-in weapon systems to bear, the automated guns spinning up with a high-pitched mechanical whine. They managed to fire a desperate 3-second burst of 30mm rounds into the darkness. But the 4th American missile found its mark before they could adjust their aim. It slammed into the bridge of the destroyer, obliterating the command deck and severing the ship's internal communications in a single, violent flash. The pilot of a nearby Z-9 helicopter, which had been idling on the flight deck, attempted an emergency takeoff as the deck tilted 30 degrees to port. The helicopter's rotors clipped a damaged radar mast, and the aircraft disintegrated in a spray of magnesium sparks and burning fuel, the wreckage sliding off the tilted deck and into the churning sea. The immediate aftermath was a scene of industrial carnage. Black smoke rose in a towering column from the Type 55, the orange glow of its internal fires visible from 20 kilometers away. The once sleek silhouette of the destroyer was now a jagged, broken ruin, its forward section dipping dangerously low into the water as the sea began to flood the forward engine rooms. The radio channels of the Chinese formation, previously filled with coordinated commands, went silent for exactly 10 seconds before erupting in a chaos of overlapping voices, each one higher and more panicked than the last. The smell of burning diesel, scorched electronics, and something far worse drifted across the water, carried by a light breeze that did nothing to cool the searing heat of the engagement zone. The battle for the Philippine Sea had transitioned from a calculated exchange of missiles into a brutal, close-quarters struggle for survival. 4:38 in the morning. The Philippine Sea, at coordinates 18 degrees 14 minutes north, 128 degrees 36 minutes east. The Chinese destroyer Lhasa was no longer a hunter. It was a shattered, listing target attempting to limp toward the northwest under a heavy shroud of its own smoke. The ship was down by the bow, its forward decks washed by the heavy Pacific swells as it struggled to maintain a speed of 12 knots. However, the most lethal threat to the Chinese vessel was not the water entering its hull, but the invisible wall of electromagnetic noise now slamming into its remaining sensor masts. From an altitude of 9,000 meters, the four FA-18 Super Hornets from the USS Ronald Reagan began their electronic attack. The lead aircraft, equipped with an ANALQ-214 integrated defensive electronic countermeasures suite, began flooding the primary frequencies of the Chinese destroyer's Type 346 Bravo active electronically scanned array radar. The air around the fighters hummed with the immense power of the jamming signals, a digital storm that turned the Lhasa's radar screens into a chaotic mess of snow and false returns. On the Chinese bridge, the remaining tactical officers found themselves blind, unable to distinguish between the approaching American aircraft and the ghost signatures generated by the sophisticated U.S. jamming software. The USS Chancellorsville, despite the fires still raging in its aft superstructure, continued to provide critical targeting data through its forward ANSPY-1 Delta radar. The data was fed through the Link 16 tactical network directly into the cockpits of the Super Hornets. The pilots saw the world through a fused digital picture, where the burning Chinese destroyer was marked as a clear, red icon against the dark blue of the sea. The smell of cold, bottled oxygen in their masks was the only scent in their sterile, high-tech world, a sharp contrast to the acrid, scorched atmosphere of the cruiser below. The lead pilot adjusted his master arm, switched to the on position, the green HUD symbols flickering as the aircraft's computer calculated the release point for a high-speed anti-radiation strike. On the deck of the Chancellorsville, the damage control efforts had reached a critical plateau. The primary fires had been contained to the aft third of the superstructure, but the heat had warped the steel deck plates so severely that the crew had to use emergency hydraulic jacks to keep the bulkheads from collapsing inward. 60% of the ship's fire main had been restored, and the sound of the pumps was a steady, reassuring throb beneath the feet of the exhausted sailors. The commanding officer received a report that 7 personnel were confirmed killed in action, with another 22 suffering from varying degrees of burns and smoke inhalation. Despite the losses, the professional discipline of the crew remained unshaken. They were already preparing the forward 5-inch gun for a surface engagement if the Chinese destroyer attempted a final, desperate charge. The Lhasa attempted one final defensive maneuver. It released a massive cloud of chaff and flares, creating a brilliant, artificial constellation of burning magnesium and aluminum foil that hung in the air for several kilometers. The goal was to confuse the incoming infrared and radar-guided seekers of any follow-on American missiles. The sea around the destroyer was illuminated in a flickering, sickly green light as the flares hit the water and continued to burn. For a few seconds, the Chinese ship disappeared from the visual sensors of the hovering Super Hornets, masked by the intense thermal signature of the defensive pyrotechnics. But the military forces had anticipated this. The E-2 Delta Hawkeye, circling 50 kilometers away, used its ANAPY-9 radar to look through the clutter, utilizing a different frequency band to maintain a firm track on the destroyer's hull. This information was instantly relayed back to the fighters. The lead pilot sighed as he watched his computer filter out the flares and lock back onto the solid mass of the Lhasa. The electronic duel was over. The Chinese ship was now digitally isolated, its communications jammed, and its eyes clouded by a superior technological force. The only sound in the pilot's ears was the steady, rhythmic tone of his missile seeker, a sound that signaled the beginning of the final phase of the engagement. 4:45 in the morning, the Philippine Sea. The Chinese destroyer, Lhasa, was a dying silhouette against the charcoal horizon, its forward half almost entirely submerged. 200 meters below the surface of the churning water, the Virginia-class submarine, USS North Carolina, designated SSN 777, was moving into its final firing position. The interior of the submarine was a world of muted blue light and the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the nuclear reactor. The sonar operators sat in a state of intense focus, their headsets capturing the tortured sounds of the Chinese vessel's hull groaning as it yielded to the immense pressure of the Pacific. In the sky above, the 4 FA-18 Super Hornets executed their final attack run. The lead pilot adjusted his flight path to approach from the destroyer's blind spot, created by the collapse of its aft radar masts. He toggled the release for 2 AGM-158 Charlie long-range anti-ship missiles. There was a dual metallic clunk as the heavy weapons separated from the wing pylons. For a heartbeat, they fell toward the sea in a dead-stick glide before their small turbojet engines ignited, with a faint orange glow. The missiles immediately dropped to an altitude of only 3 meters, their onboard artificial intelligence searching for the specific structural weak points of the Type 55 destroyer. The transition to the killing blow was a masterpiece of multi-domain coordination. While the missiles were mid-flight, the USS North Carolina flooded its forward torpedo tubes. The commanding officer of the submarine gave the order to fire. A high-pressure burst of water ejected a Mark 48 advanced capability torpedo into the deep. Spun up instantly, creating a low-frequency whine that traveled through the water at over 50 knots. The torpedo was wire-guided, trailing a thin strand of fiber-optic cable that allowed the submarine's tactical computers to feed it real-time sonar updates. The ocean around the bottom of Lhasa was now a kill zone, with lethal energy closing in from both above and below the waterline. The AGM-100 and 58 Charlie missiles struck first. They did not simply hit the side of the ship. They performed a pop-up maneuver in the final 500 meters, diving vertically into the destroyer's midsection. The first missile punched through the hangar deck, detonating deep inside the fuel storage bunkers. The second missile tore through the base of the primary sensor mast, vaporizing the remaining electronic warfare suites. The sound was a jagged, rolling series of explosions that sent a fountain of white-hot magnesium and burning JP-5 fuel 150 meters into the air. The internal temperature of the Lhasa's midsection spiked to over 2,000 degrees, melting the aluminum partitions and turning the interior of the ship into a blast furnace. 3 seconds later, the Mark 48 torpedo reached its target. It did not strike the hull directly, but detonated exactly 5 meters beneath the destroyer's keel near the engine room. This was the secure break-back maneuver. The explosion created a massive gas bubble that lifted the 13,000-ton destroyer entirely out of the water for a fraction of a second. As the bubble collapsed, the ship's keel, unsupported by the water, snapped under its own immense weight. Sound was a horrific, metallic crack that resonated through the water for 50 kilometers. The Lhasa broke in two, the bow and stern, sections tilting toward each other as the sea rushed into the shattered remains of the hull. The reaction from the surviving Chinese crew was one of chaotic, desperate survival. Life rafts were deployed manually as the ship's power failed completely, leaving the lower decks in absolute darkness as the water rose. Sailors leaped from the tilting decks into the oil-slicked swells, their orange life vests the only spots of color in a world of gray smoke and black water. The Super Hornets circled overhead, their infrared cameras recording the final moments of the vessel for the after-action report. There was no return fire. The destroyer's weapons were either submerged or twisted into useless scrap metal. The professional discipline that had characterized the Chinese Navy during the early phases of the engagement had dissolved into a raw struggle against the indifferent gravity of the ocean. The immediate aftermath was a haunting silence that seemed to settle over the Philippine Sea. The two halves of the Lhasa slipped beneath the surface at 4:52 in the morning, leaving behind a massive whirlpool of air bubbles. and floating debris. A thick, iridescent slick of diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid spread across the surface, reflecting the first faint light of the approaching dawn. The smell of the sea, usually fresh and salt-heavy, was replaced by the suffocating stench of burnt rubber and scorched iron. The USS North Carolina remained submerged. Its mission complete. While the Super Hornets turned back toward the USS Ronald Reagan, their fuel gauges low, but their mission objectives fully achieved. The battle at coordinates 18 degrees 14 minutes north was over, but the structural damage to the regional peace was total. 5:15 in the morning. The Philippine Sea. The first pale light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, revealing the true extent of the devastation visited upon the cruiser CG-62 USS Chancellorsville. The ship was no longer the pristine gray Sentinel that had patrolled these waters only an hour before. Its aft superstructure was a blackened, skeletal ruin with jagged ribbons of aluminum peeled back like the skin of a fruit. Wisps of acrid white smoke still rose from the impact zone, curling into the damp morning air and mixing with the natural mist rising from the swells. Despite the scars, the American flag still flew. From the forward mast, a defiant splash of color against the charcoal gray sky. The destroyer, USS Barry, designated DDG-52, arrived on the scene at 5:20 in the morning. It slowed to a crawl as it approached the wounded cruiser, its own ANSPY-1 radar rotating in a constant, wary scan of the surrounding airspace. The Barry looked like a ghost ship emerging from the fog, its hull cutting silently through the oil-slicked water. On its flight deck, the crew had already prepared the MH-60 Sierra helicopter for immediate medical evacuation. The sound of the helicopter's rotors was a steady, comforting rhythm that signaled the arrival of the full weight of the United States Navy's logistical and medical power. Transferring the wounded was a delicate and grueling process. Because the Chancellorsville's aft flight deck was compromised by structural damage and debris, the casualties had to be moved by hand-carried litters across the pitching main deck to the midships refueling station. From there, they were hoisted by a rescue hoist into the hovering helicopter. The air was thick, with the smell of salt spray and the copper tang of blood mixed with the ever-present stench of burnt insulation. 28 sailors were evacuated. In the first hour, their faces pale under the green glow of the helicopter's interior lights as they were flown toward the advanced surgical facilities on the USS Ronald Reagan. By 6 in the morning, the focus shifted from survival to the recovery of the enemy. Following the strict protocols of the Geneva Convention and the traditions of the sea, the USS Barry deployed 2 rigid-hull inflatable boats to search for survivors from the Chinese destroyer Lhasa. The surface of the water was littered with debris, charred life jackets, pieces of insulation, and large patches of iridescent fuel oil that smoothed the waves into a sickening, glassy texture. The American sailors pulled 14 Chinese survivors from the water, most of them suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. They were treated with the same professional medical care as the American wounded, a stark contrast to the violence of the previous hour. The engineering assessment of the Chancellorsville was completed at 6:30 in the morning. The primary hull remained sound, and 2 of the 4 gas turbine engines were cleared for operation at limited power. However, the loss of the aft steering and the significant weight of the water used to fight the fires meant the ship could not transit under its own power at a safe speed. The decision was made to prepare for a towing operation. The USS Barry moved into position ahead of the cruiser, and a heavy towing hawser, nearly 30 centimeters in diameter, was passed between the 2 ships. The physical connection between the 2 vessels was a testament to the resilience of the fleet. One ship providing the muscle, while the other maintained a limited defensive watch with its remaining forward sensors. As the 2 ships began their slow, 5-knot crawl toward the safety of Naval Station Guam, the sun finally cleared the horizon. The light revealed a sea that looked remarkably peaceful, the deep blue of the Pacific hiding the thousands of tons of steel that now rested on the ocean floor. The USS Chancellorsville was listing 3 degrees to port, but it was stable. Its crew, many of whom had not slept in over 30 hours, stood on the weather decks in their scorched coveralls, watching the wake of the Berry lead them home. They had survived a direct hit from a supersonic missile and had seen the destruction of one of the most powerful warships in the world. The cost had been high, measured in lives lost and a storied ship broken, but the tactical objective of maintaining freedom of navigation in the Philippine Sea had been upheld. 1 week later, Apra Harbor, Guam. The cruiser CG-62 USS Chancellorsville was finally coming home. Though not under its own power, the blackened, jagged scar on its port side was a silent, grim witness to the first high-intensity naval duel of the 21st century. The tropical sun beat down on the calm, turquoise water of the harbor, reflecting off the shattered aluminum of the superstructure, where the YJ-18 missile had ended the lives of 9 American sailors. 2 civilian tugboats, their engines churning the water into frothing white circles, worked in tandem to guide the 10,000-ton warship toward Sierra Pier. On the pier, hundreds of sailors from the Guam Submarine Squadron and the Pacific Command stood in formation, their white uniforms a stark contrast to the scorched and salt-stained hull of the cruiser. There was no music, only the low hum of the tugboat engines and the occasional crying of gulls. As the first mooring lines were thrown across the gap, a heavy silence settled over the harbor. The crew of the Chancellorsville stood along the rail, their faces etched with a fatigue that went deeper than physical exhaustion. They had spent 7 days in a constant state of damage control, fighting the sea and the structural failures of their own ship to ensure it did not become a permanent monument on the floor of the Philippine Sea. The final after-action report, classified at the highest levels of the United States Navy, provided a clinical assessment of the engagement. The Aegis Combat System had performed within its designed parameters, successfully identifying and intercepting 5 out of 6 incoming supersonic threats. However, the report highlighted the Vampire 1 impact as a critical lesson in modern naval warfare. The combination of sea-skimming maneuvers and high-G terminal agility could still find a seam in even the most advanced defensive screens. The total cost for the military forces was heavy: 9 personnel killed in action, 34 wounded, and an estimated $500 million in structural and electronic damage to a primary capital ship. The cost for the foreign military was total. The loss of the Type 55 destroyer Lhasa represented a significant blow to their regional power projection. An estimated 280 foreign sailors were lost when the ship broke its keel and sank in under 7 minutes. The 14 survivors rescued by the naval warship were currently being processed at a secure facility on Guam, providing intelligence that would be analyzed for years to come. The engagement at coordinates 18 degrees 14 minutes north had proven that while the military forces could be hurt, its ability to coordinate a multi-domain counterstrike integrating surface ships, carrier-based aviation, and nuclear-powered submarines remained the dominant force in the Pacific. In Washington, D.C., the Secretary of Defense addressed the media from the Pentagon briefing room. He spoke in measured, professional tones, emphasizing that the military forces would continue to operate wherever international law allowed. Behind his words lay a new strategic reality. The red line in the Philippine Sea had been crossed, and the result was a graveyard of high-tech steel at the bottom of the ocean. The incident had shifted the geopolitical landscape of the region, forcing every nation in the Pacific to reevaluate their own naval doctrines in the face of such destructive kinetic potential. As the sun began to set over Apra Harbor, the Chancellorsville was finally secured to the pier. Large yellow cranes were already being moved into position to begin the long process of stripping away the damaged sections of the superstructure. The ship would eventually be repaired and returned to the fleet, a testament to the durability of military naval engineering and the courage of the sailors who refused to let it sink. But for now, it sat quietly in the shadows of the palms, a wounded veteran of a war that everyone hoped would not go any further. The Philippine Sea was quiet again, the waves washing over the spot where the Lhasa had gone down, erasing the oil slicks and the debris until only the deep, cold blue remained.